Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's so nice to have all of you. We are excited. This is a full week for the World Affairs Council. We've had program after program, and they continue on. So it's so nice to have all of you tonight. My name is Marianne Maldonado. On behalf of everyone here at the World Affairs Council, we're honored to have you. And I'm glad you can join our program tonight with Sam Katz. Before we begin, there's so many things that we are doing that we want to make sure we give you a diverse lineup of programming. And a couple of those things I want to mention. How many of you know or have heard the name John Meacham? John Meacham, yes, good, excellent. We are honored that John will join us this Saturday. It's an unusual Saturday program that we are hosting, but it is going to be this Saturday. If you have not registered, it is an afternoon program, and it is in commemoration of America's 250th anniversary. We are going to host, he is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and every attendee is going to receive a copy of his signed book, and seats are going fast. It's going to be an exciting day. His book is called American Struggle. And it's a brand new book that he is featuring, and we are honored to have someone of his caliber here in Houston. And as he floats through, we are going to have him for our weekend program. Then on March 17th, we have our Institute. Several of you have been to our Global Affairs and U.S. Foreign Policy Institute. It is a 7-week program that we do 3 times a year. There are 3 different curriculums involved with that. We are going to begin that on March 17. So it gives you a couple of weeks to get yourself organized. It is a unique program in that we do it every Tuesday for 7 weeks. You get a certification when you're finished. And this time we are going to be speaking on dictators, democracies, and difficult decisions. And it's going to be covering a time when authoritarianism was on the rise and geopolitical fault lines are shifting. This is going to be a very important conversation that Ronan leads on our behalf. He is an amazing speaker as well as teacher, and he is going to give us the opportunity to also engage with some very, very enlightened speakers every Tuesday afternoon as a part of the in-person program. I think there's also still an online version. Is that correct, Maria? So if you're interested in the online version of the Institute, that's going to begin March 17th. So don't forget to mark your calendars. Also on March 17th, how many of you know what March 17th is? St. Patrick's Day, yes. Also on March 17th, in addition to St. Patrick's Day and in addition to the Institute, we will host the Council's 4th International Women's Day Symposium. This is an amazing program that we set aside an afternoon, not just for ladies, but also for men, for professional development, for career coaching, but also for engagement and conversations. And you'll meet some really fun, dynamic people, whether you're on your way to the C-suite or already there, or maybe you've retired from the C-suite and want to mentor some young people. Please register for that. It's on March 17th. It's at the beautiful Post Oak Hotel. And it's one of those times that we really get to enjoy each other in a beautiful environment. And we've really tried to up-level this conference from years past. So it'll be a really amazing experience for all of us. I do want to point out a couple of things that, how many of you picked up one of these? Yes, good. Usually when we pass these out, it means that we are likely have added something to it. So if you have one previous, make sure you pick up a new one. A few things I want to point out is we do have a young professionals program, and those are ongoing monthly. And then we have something called Wine and Wisdom. And this is a program that we do in our council offices. It's meant to be a very much more intimate gathering. You have a chance to speak more one-on-one with the speakers. It's on different content. The next one is going to be this Thursday, and it's going to be speaking about Saudi Arabia and their kingdom of football. Could be very interesting. Because it's at our offices, we usually have the great problem of selling out quickly. And I don't know if we have any seats left, but make sure you register online, and if there are seats, they'll let you register through. And then lastly, I want to mention a couple of things. How many of you are current members of the World Affairs Council? Excellent. Thank you all for your membership. That really is meaningful. And one of the things that your membership helped do this past week was to host 400 high school students to our academic World Quest program. And it's an international affairs competition where we host high school teams from high schools all across the city. We had close to 400 kids, 90 teams competed. And the winning team, we together collectively scholarship to send up to our national competition in Washington, D.C., which would be held in April, late April. And in the past 3 years, we've come in top 3, but we haven't made that first place win yet. So fingers crossed that our team from Houston will win this year. Also, I want to remind everybody of our membership levels. We have a unique new membership level that we've had for a minute. I very seldom talk about it, but maybe, Linda, you'll stand up and show us your beautiful. No, she's not going to stand up and show us her beautiful. How about pulling off your name? Anyway, it's a pretty little name badge that you get, but not only that is your golden ticket. It's your golden ticket into every program throughout the course of the year. So make sure that you spend time thinking through your membership level and if it makes sense for you as an individual or couple, because international delegates are couple levels, and make sure it makes sense for you to be an international delegate, or you might want to do the a la carte method, but it really offers you a lot of discounts through the course of the year and entry automatically into things without an additional fee. So that's called the international delegate level. And thank you, Linda, for letting me help you put you on the spot. Before I introduce our speaker, we have these question cards. They've gotten smaller over time. I guess, Ronan, you want the questions to be smaller, I assume. Anyway, our colleagues will be passing these out midway through. And if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand and they'll give you one of those. Now it's my honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight, who has made quite a commitment in coming here. He had a very long day of travel and just arrived. So please let me explain a little bit about his background. Sam Katz is a New York Times bestselling author who's written over 20 books on the Arab-Israeli conflict, military and law enforcement, special operations, espionage, and counterterrorism. He's written hundreds of articles for magazines and journals around the world, as well as documentaries for television. He is also the former editor-in-chief of Special Operations Report, a trade publication for the world's commando and counter-terrorist community. He will be joined by our colleague, Ronan O'Malley, and please join me in welcoming Sam Katz to the conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Marianne. Thank you all for coming, and most especially before we even get into the heart of the talk. Sam's plane was over 4 hours late. He literally just walked in right now. He has not eaten anything since breakfast. Maybe I'll pass you a cookie and some coffee. The wine, maybe we can get afterwards. But I feel bad, Sam, because here we're talking about probably the most legendary person in terms of pursuing terrorists who have abused people, and I feel like I'm abusing you. So I hope you're doing okay. I know you're exhausted. You've been up since who knows when, and yeah.
The moment we can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
The moment we lifted off, everything went okay. So I'm very happy and honored to be here in front of all of you. Thank you.
And before we get to Meir Dagan, who probably a lot of people might have heard the name, especially anyone who's familiar with Israel, anyone who has an intelligence background, in particular military background. I would just say your book is fascinating because this is one of those cases where if I went to Hollywood and said, here's a screenplay, and I took your book and said, this is going to happen, they'd say, that's absolutely crazy. There's no way one person could do all of this. If it's 3 or 4 different people over decades, maybe. But this is real life, larger than life, incredibly courageous, inventive, fascinating story. But before we even get into him, I want to maybe start with what absolutely motivated him. You mentioned in the book, his parents were lucky to survive in Poland and then Ukraine, that they were they had to work in labor camps, brutal labor camps in Soviet Union for 5 years, but they did survive. They came back eventually to their hometown, Lucknow in Poland. Out of 12,000 Jews, only 150 survived. Basically 1% of the Jewish population survived. Can you talk about one of the most powerful things in the book is something that happened a few years before he was born, and about the incredible and heartbreaking and terrifying photo of his maternal grandfather, who was also a rabbi, and how he used that photo to motivate himself, motivate any agents he was sending into harm's way, that this is why you're doing it, or even meeting with intelligence leaders or political leaders from other countries to say, never again, this is what we're doing. Israelis and Jews will never be a victim again. Can you talk about that photo?
So just to go back to what you said earlier about how could one man do this, there's a special breed of individual who have to work twice as hard for half the credit. And that motivates them to really go above and beyond what's even considered way above and beyond to many. And Meir Dagan was one such person. He was born in the ashes of the Holocaust in Ukraine, and the loss of family, the loss of his heritage, motivated him in ways that defiance in terms of stopping anyone else from ever trying to eradicate the Jewish people, and namely those who live in the Jewish state, would be his mission in life. And one of the things that really struck me to him was I met him shortly before his death, and we were talking, and my background is not that similar to his. I wasn't born in Ukraine, but my parents escaped the Holocaust and made it to Israel. And growing up in New York, because they eventually emigrated, I didn't have family. And all the friends that they had, who were these refugees and people who survived by the skin of their teeth, some of the people who had survived the camps, all of a sudden became uncle this and aunt that. And he grew up in a similar background. But in addition to that, growing up, he discovered a photo of his maternal grandfather being mocked by the SS shortly before he was executed. He was supposed to act like a horse, and someone was riding him before the two men were shot in the back of the head. And that humiliation, that loss of a grandparent as a symbol of the loss of 6 million Jews impacted him. Now, Meir Dagan was not a religious person. His mother, Mina, always said, "How could I believe in a God that allowed 1 million children to be slaughtered in the camps?" But he believed in something else. He believed in the Jewish people. He believed in the Jewish state. And he believed that those that had that special DNA, that secret sauce, had to step up and do whatever they could to defend the Jewish nation. And in many ways, and I'm sure we'll get into this, the Jewish nation is a personification of the Western world. And he looked at that as a very important mission, almost a sacrosanct mission, a holy one, where he could do whatever he could, either on the battlefield or in the shadows, to ensure that the good guys came out on top.
There's so much in your book, like I say, and it reads like a Hollywood thriller. What he did countless times, either directly as part of the IDF in the military, or on special operations forces, where he was undercover in disguise, behind enemy lines, and then later the wild exploits he'd cook up as the director of Mossad, and really the most dynamic and influential director of Mossad ever, probably most people would say. Maybe just one of these stories that just blew me away about his courage. And it amazed me that he only got Israel's second highest award for valor. I think he should have gotten the equivalent of our Medal of Honor. As a young man, he's part of the IDF. Like a lot of people, came from a poor background, not necessarily geared towards the officer class. He takes part in the Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War wars. Can you recount the tale of him and the grenade and wrestling someone with a grenade and something that really sounds like to be Sylvester Stallone, but this is what he actually did.
So Meir Dagan, his name at the time was, he was born Meir Uberman. And he eventually Hebraicized his name because it was seen as a quicker path toward advancement in the IDF. He was a junior officer who was working in Sinai, Gaza area, and he was wounded. His Jeep ran over a landmine. And he was sort of requisitioned to a special operations unit that was doing counterterrorism. He was summoned one day to the office of Major General Ariel Sharon, who was bigger than life, who was the proverbial bull in the china shop. And the two men struck a friendship. And ultimately, Meir Dagan was allowed to put into practice a belief that he had, that the only way to stop terrorism, because there was a terrorist uprising in Gaza, was to get in the bad guy's skin, was to make them so scared to come out of the shadows at night that they would spend so much energy in protecting themselves that they wouldn't have time to attack Israeli soldiers or Israeli civilians. And he created a unit called Rimon, which in English translates to grenade, and it was an undercover unit. It was the first undercover unit of its kind. And his men, largely recruited from Bedouin soldiers who were the Arabic speakers, would go out dressed as Arabs. He would dress as a Palestinian. He didn't speak Arabic other than a few curse words and yalla yalla move it, but he thought he did. And they would go out in the places where the terrorists felt the safest. And they would go to the bars, they would go to the brothels, they would go to the coffee houses, and they would learn how the bad guys thought, how they operated, where they hung out, who their mistresses were, which ones were homosexual, which ones weren't. And together with the Shin Bet and military intelligence, they built this dossier of individuals, and they hunted them. And one of the individuals was a guy codenamed Abu Nimr, who was one of the heads of this group. And they encountered him. They were masquerading as cab drivers. They found him in a cab, and they had a standoff. And Abu Nimr pulled the grenade. And rather than shoot him and risk the grenade going off and injuring his men, Dagan wrestled the grenade from his hand right after he pulled the pin, managed to put the pin in back safely, and then subdued Abu Nimr. Saved his men, arrested a very valuable terrorist, because forget what you read in the paper. Nobody reads papers anymore. What you see online or what you see in the news. Live terrorists are much better than dead terrorists. Dead men don't talk, and everyone who you can glean intelligence from has value. So it was a very courageous act. He was awarded Israel's second highest Medal of Valor for that. But again, what I said earlier about how he was someone who always in his life had to work twice as hard for half the credit, because he was a protege of Ariel Sharon. Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister, didn't like him, and he tried to always put his finger on the scales of promotion or kudos that would ultimately be worthy of his service, because politics always invades the military, and military, as we've seen from prime ministers that have come since, invades politics.
Some of you might already have some of Sam's books, multiple bestsellers. You've been writing on the Middle East and having in particular terrorism, counterterrorism for 20 plus years. His career progresses well. Maybe just to take it up to and how it connects to where we are today. If we think about kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of times terrorist groups, insurgencies, rebellions, whether it be in the IRA in Ireland or Che and Castro in Cuba, or even say some of the Palestinian groups at the time, they might have a more socialist or leftist lean and a nationalist lean, but oftentimes they're secular. In the 80s is really kind of when the emergence of the Islamist element comes and actually leads to serious trouble for Arafat. Can you talk about how that change is emerging in the 80s, and in particular, what lessons he learned in the Israeli invasion in 1982 of southern Lebanon, And basically, this is what kicks off eventually Hezbollah, which obviously still dealing with now.
So Meir Dagan fought in the 1973 war. It was a war that Israel was caught by surprise. It was caught by surprise by arrogance, overconfidence, and it was also caught by surprise because the fear was that if Israel launched a preemptive strike, it would be labeled the aggressor in the international community. At the time, Prime Minister Golda Meir opted to absorb an attack rather than preempt it. And the result was 2,500 Israeli soldiers were killed in 18 days of fighting. Meir Dagan fought in that war on the Sinai front with Ariel Sharon. He crossed the canal. He was involved in special operations at the time. The way that you advanced in the Israeli military was you became a tank officer. The Armored Corps was the largest arm of the military, and he went into tanks. And he worked in divisions that worked in Israel's north. Israel's north changed in 1978. There was a terrorist attack launched in Israel. Israel had a small invasion of Lebanon in March of that year. And he then worked as a liaison officer to the Christian militias in southern Lebanon. And he saw many things of the local landscape that really fascinated him in terms of culture, in terms of immersing himself in the mindset of the people who live there. But he also began to see, right after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, that there was a fundamentalist change going over the Shia of southern Lebanon. And the Shia of southern Lebanon had been the allies of the Israelis, because the Palestinians, who were Sunnis, who had occupied southern Lebanon and most of the country and had turned it into a state within a state, had really abused the Christians and the Shia. In 1982, he's the commander of the 188th Armored Brigade, and he leads his campaign along the coastal highway toward Beirut. And his brigade is at the forefront. His brigade suffers terrible losses. And this is a turning point for him because he becomes a man of war who despises war. And he realizes that there's a human toll to military overreach. And Israel's plan in 1982 was to install a Christian leadership in Lebanon that was pro-Israel. So nation building was beyond the pay grade, beyond the scale of what Israel was capable of. Right after the war, his performance was amazingly successful. He became the head of the Southern Lebanon Liaison Unit. And here he became the intelligence spy chief in combating the new emergence of the Shia terrorism that was being sparked by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in southern Lebanon. And he became really a junior spy chief in combating the suicide bombings, the roadside bombings that took a great toll in Israeli life and Israeli soldiers, and turned Lebanon for 18 years into Israel's Vietnam, a quagmire. And he also began to understand something, as from the intelligence perspective, that the conflict was really more than just a political dialogue that was expressed on the battlefield or in hijackings or in the murder of civilians. This was a clash of civilizations. This was a clash of civilizations where there was no compromise, where there could be no accord reached over a negotiating table. This was existential life and death. And this was something that ultimately the Palestinians would adopt in the emergence of Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, where this was no longer the charming playboy terrorist of the Carlos of 1970s that you would see in a James Bond film. These were people who were motivated by religious zeal. And also this religious zeal became their business. And this was the embryonic emergence of the notion that Meir Dagan had, that governments around the world would later follow, was that money was the oxygen that fueled all the hatred and violence. And that you'll never get people to change their colors. However, if you can bankrupt them to the point where they can't kill you, you've mitigated a threat to a level that you could live alongside it.
And after this, I want to get up to his, kind of legendary years leading Mossad. But just for people to get an idea of the person that he was remarkable, just a natural charismatic leader, but he was also humble. You say he would listen to people. He would work harder than anybody. But can you maybe also talk about the fact that, he had a litmus test, whether it was earlier in special forces or later in the Mossad. I will not send anyone on a mission that is not conceived well enough or is too dangerous that I would not send my own brother on. Can you talk about why he was so probably more popular than almost any other Israeli general and then later Mossad director by the people who served under him than anyone else in history?
He was a man who legend headed. He was interviewed on 60 Minutes by Leslie Stahl, and she said, "You're known as a man who kills Arabs for breakfast." And he liked the reputation, even though it was inaccurate, because it set the tone of who he was or what the office represented. But he was a man who broke down in 1982 when one of his battalion commanders was killed. And he broke down in tears and had a small nervous breakdown. He was also a vegetarian who had once, when he was in charge of the Southern Lebanon Liaison Unit, went to visit a Druze militia commander who had just taken over a Christian village and had massacred everyone in there. And the Druze officer offered Dagan, from the corpse of a dead Christian militiaman, a piece of his brain on a stick. And he said, "Never again could I eat meat." So he was an individual who, although he had this hardened persona, had a love for life in general. He appreciated life and he cherished life. And also as an armor officer, when you're one of 5 in a tank, you learn to live with others and you're the father. And he had a very paternal outlook on the people who worked for him. And when whatever he did, no matter what, when he was in the IDF and the operations directorate, and he would send commandos on strikes across enemy lines or inside a village where they were outnumbered on a very dangerous mission, he would always have what he called the Dan Dagan test. Dan Dagan is his son. And if he wouldn't send his own kid on this mission, he wasn't going to send anyone. And the people who worked for him appreciated that. The people who worked for him appreciated that every Friday, for example, he would call in people for what is known in Hebrew as Pei Aleph, the acronym for a personal meeting. And he would sit and talk to people. This could be someone who's running an operation in Iran with 200 agents in the field, and he would ask him about his kids. He would ask him about his wife's illness. He would ask him about, did he eat anything interesting of late? In the new restaurant. He got to know people. He appreciated people. And one of the stories that I have in the book and that someone told me and that really defines who he was. They had right after he became head of the Mossad, they had an event for someone who had been promoted. And the person who had been promoted was someone who would eventually become the future head of the Mossad, who was known for being a very good-looking guy. And then Meir Dagan took the stage, and he knew that people didn't want an outsider leading the agency. The Mossad is a bureaucracy, a government bureaucracy like any place else. And he said, "I'm short, I'm fat, I'm bald, and I'm ugly, and I'm not going anywhere." And people left sort of in disbelief and not knowing what to make out of it. And his security detail was waiting outside, but Meir Dagan was nowhere to be found. He made a point to thank everyone who worked at that event, the caterers, the servers, the cleaners. He shook everyone's hand. He spoke to them. He spent 2 hours extra there, thanking them for being an integral part of this machine. And people appreciated this because this was although Israel is an egalitarian state where people didn't really salute much and they didn't call their commanders sir, this was something that was very, very unique. And he believed that the human component of leadership, especially of a very finely wound spring like the Mossad, was an essential component to its success. Prior to his arrival as the head of the Mossad, the agency had become very analytical, very bourgeois almost. It had become a league of gentlemen. And then 9/11 happens, the second intifada happens. And this is a war where you have to roll up your sleeves and kill people. And he realized that he was going to have to call upon his men and his women to do a lot of very dirty, very unsavory tasks. And he made sure that no matter what, two things happened. They were comfortable in their mission, and they knew that he knew that it was of the utmost importance, otherwise he wouldn't send them. And just as a side note to this, he realized that some of the men and women in his ranks that worked for him would have to do some very unstomachable things, sleep around, eat stuff that they weren't accustomed to eating. So he hired a rabbi to give it sort of religious, the certificate of being kosher, that they could do these things because it was a greater good. And before he sent people out, he would bring them to this photo of his maternal grandfather. And he would say, this is why you're doing what you're doing. Because never again meant never again for him. And it was something that everyone who worked for him, everyone who he met, be it the head of Saudi intelligence or President George W. Bush, understood that this was someone who was not going to compromise with the safety of the Jewish state and the future survival of the Jewish people.
A few things. Your book is excellent. I learned a lot. Basically, even if you're just curious about Israeli kind of military defense and intelligence history since its founding, but especially since he was an adult to the IDF, the 60s, 1960s through today, because you address what's happening recently. It's excellent for that, but I think you're also pretty fair and balanced. He was an incredible revolutionary figure, was adored and revered by those who are protecting, and despised and hated by those who'd be going after. You do mention that there are times, at one point you mentioned an Israeli general who says, I think drafted charges possibly against him for excessive use of force, maybe inconsiderate use in terms of innocent civilians, in terms of operations that are carried out. Did that change over time? And you mentioned in the book, there were some of these operations, whether it be special forces before when he was just an IDF, or later, even maybe through Mossad, that even in the United States, and we have some hard chargers in our special forces and our intelligence agencies, our CI paramilitary officers, those were lines we would not cross. How do you define them in that area?
I think it's a dangerous statement to say these are lines we wouldn't cross, because we cross those lines every day. The intelligence world, the special ops world, is a very murky, it's not black and white. There are a million shades of gray. So to your point, he understood that, well, let me backtrack, I apologize. The head of the Mossad doesn't say you are a bad guy and I'm going to put explosives in your walkie-talkie and kill you. There's a process. I saw someone on MSNBC once, right after there was an Israeli strike in Syria, saying that this is Netanyahu just deciding he wants to kill people. It doesn't work that way. There's a process. Targets are selected, targets are reviewed. There are committees that review these individuals. There is a notice that goes to the prime minister. The prime minister must sign off on it. It is as bureaucratic and as legally found in terms of international law as you can find. Meir Dagan never believed that killing was a form of vengeance. Killing was preemptive. Imad Mugnia, who is the special operations head of Hezbollah, who up until 9/11 killed more Americans than any other terrorist in the world, who was assassinated by a joint operation with Mossad and the CIA, wasn't killed because he blew up the Marine barracks or two embassies, or he had beat a U.S. Navy diver to death personally on board a hijacked TWA airliner. He was killed because it was likely that whatever he did in the past would be replicated 10 times worse in the future. And in order to save lives going forward, you had to take out the people whose business was killing civilians. That was the mindset, and that remains the mindset. It's not killing for killing's sake. There is an advocate general. There are legal advisors in the prime minister's office. And again, the prime minister appoints two people in the intelligence community, the head of Mossad and the head of the Shin Bet, which is the combination of the FBI and Secret Service. Those men answer directly to the prime minister. And on every operation, be it small or be it large, the prime minister signs off on it. There were some prime ministers that gave Meir Dagan almost a blank check because they revered him and they understood that he would not propose something that would be politically or ethically or legally damaging. And then there were some, Netanyahu, who was more indecisive and more politically calculating when it came to making decisions. And he tried to keep everything up in the air so that his name, in case something went wrong, and things always go wrong, would not be linked to him politically and not damage him politically. Again, the beast is the person who sits in charge of everything, and the buck stops there. So, yes, he was this hard charger guy who Hollywood should make movies about, and hopefully they'll make a movie from the book so I can retire. But there is a process in Israel, and there's a process in Israel even today in the post-October 7th reality that we live in, of who can be targeted, how people are targeted, how locations are targeted. Israel, for all the negative press it receives, is a democracy. It is one that adheres to the letter of the law, and that if you look in terms of warfare or special operations, what goes on, Israel's body count in terms of collateral damage and civilian deaths is far lower than other countries, including this one. Not to jump ahead of you, but when we were talking in the car from the airport about the beeper operation and Obama's CIA director, Leon Panetta, who I interviewed for the book, said that the beeper operation was an act of terrorism. Well, during the, because innocent civilians were harmed. Well, during the Obama administration, drones took out scores of civilians in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Obama took out a US citizen in Yemen. So the fact that the statement that we don't do it, or that Israel sometimes goes to places that we don't, is not 100% accurate. Nations have a responsibility to protect their citizens. They have intelligence agencies and special operations elements to do the dirty work, to make sure that people can go to bed at night and wake up alive the next morning.
I want to turn to Iran in a moment. You mentioned how Mossad was an effective intelligence gathering operation, operatives and assets abroad, but he took it to a whole nother level in terms of following the money, financial Tevelsip. How do you say that? What's the word? I can't remember.
The unit in Hebrew is called tzilzal.
Tzilzal.
And it translates to harpoon.
But very smart and very wise and effective thing that had not been done effectively before. The U.S. similarly would do more of that after 9/11 ourselves. We'd kind of learn from each other. Like I said, we'll turn to Iran in a bit. But for me, probably what is the most notable and long-lasting part of his legacy will be the alliances and the connections that he built with crucial nations in the region. Besides, non-Arab nations, like Turkey or non-Arab groups like the Kurds, but for the vital key Arab players, whether it be the Emirates in the Gulf, the Saudis, and others, he, in a lot of ways, it surprised me, was the lead. He was not in the foreign service. He's not a diplomat in making those relationships. But can you talk about why, in some ways, let's be honest, in a part of the world where you have monarchies or you have kind of elections, but democracies maybe not as important, a lot of those Arab leaders might have had more respect for a hardcore special forces guy who's incredible at intelligence background than someone who was elected to a position, and why he was instrumental in improving relations with the Jordanians, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis. You mentioned plenty of people in your book you spoke to, you can't say their names, but how did he really set the table for Israeli relations and the Abraham Accords, maybe what could have happened with the Saudis if October 7th didn't happen? Can you discuss that huge part of his legacy?
So King Hussein in the 70s coined the phrase espionage diplomacy because he had known the heads of Mossad, and he had worked with them to try and keep the Middle East sane. There are many people who spoke Arabic. Dagan really didn't, but he understood that Israel was an integral part of the Middle East. There was no way around it. And there are really two Middle Easts. There's the Middle East that you see on the news of fanatics and people threatening war. And there's the real Middle East, where there are private jets that fly from Riyadh into Tel Aviv or from Oman into Tel Aviv, where businessmen and spies meet their counterparts. They work on common goals. And Meir Dagan understood this, that without partners, Israel was a small country without many natural resources. Its only natural resource, the two natural resources that the country possessed, was its brain power and courage and its strategic alliance with the United States. And that had value. And the Arab states envied that. And they wanted to glean from that. And they wanted to be part of that. They wanted Israeli technologies. Well, you couldn't, if you were an Israeli arms manufacturer, you couldn't really sell to the Saudis unless you did it in secret. And who does stuff in secret? The Mossad. And who arranges these relationships? The division in the Mossad that is responsible for foreign liaison, and the charismatic director of the Mossad, who is somewhat of a celebrity and who's a general. And the Arab intelligence chiefs used to love to call him general. In Jordan, the Jordanians called generals Pasha, a relic from the Turkish term. They bestow enormous reverence on military commanders and generals. This was not something, being a general wasn't a scarlet letter for him. It was an American Express Platinum card into the VIP lounge. And people, when they came to Israel from the Middle East, they didn't want to stop at the prime minister's office for a photo op. They wanted to go to Mossad headquarters. They wanted to go to his office. They wanted to sit with him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. They wanted to hear his strategic insight, what he thought was happening, what he believed should happen. I know that Netanyahu and Trump took credit for the Abraham Accord with Bahrain and the UAE, Morocco and the others, but the Mossad had their fingers in that pie long before there was the ceremony on the White House. The Mossad had a mini station put up in Dubai in 2005, 15 years before the Abraham Accord. Spies talk. They talk the same language. They understand one another. And they're the ones in many ways that propel their nations forward around the chatter, around the white noise of politics and media attention and all the disinformation that now social media happens. Jean le Carré, the great spy novelist, once wrote that the intelligence services are the only true reflection of a nation's character. And Meir Dagan believed, le Carré was his favorite author, but he believed that the Mossad was the symbol of everything that was good in the state of Israel. And he wanted to export it. And this is a reason why there were many in the Mossad and the Israeli intelligence establishment that were really angry at Dagan, because Dagan had a belief that if you spend the money, if you have the technology and you risk lives to gather intelligence, keeping it encrypted in a file somewhere, saving it for a rainy day was a waste of resources. It needed to be shared. You had to speak, you had to share, you had to let people know that this was the intelligence, these were the threats, and they had to work together in many cases to stop them. And under Dagan's leadership, relationships with the Arab services and other services around the world improved. Someone once said that they went from being very mundane to going on steroids. He pushed it, and he was always traveling, always disappearing for a few days, sometimes accompanying the prime minister. I write in the book that when Netanyahu would go and visit Putin, Dagan would go with him, and Putin liked to speak to Dagan. Men from the same DNA of an intelligence background spoke a language that others didn't understand. And spies, unlike politicians, tended not to lie. They didn't care about polls. They didn't care about their standing within the party, and they didn't care about coalition building. There's a Hebrew saying, tachlis, meaning the real thing. Spies spoke the way it was, and they gave assessments based on fact rather than political ambition or trying to move the needle somewhere in the upcoming election. And people respected that with Dagan. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but one of the places where that was respected the most was in Langley, Virginia, at the CIA and at the White House, where he would speak to Bush on critical issues, ranging from the development of a Syrian nuclear reactor to the Iranian ambitions. And his candor, his personality, his optimistic outlook on life convinced Bush and others in that administration, even though there were a few detractors, they convinced them that this was someone who spoke the truth, spoke truth to power, and whose word was rock solid, and that if he said something, you could take it to the bank.
Just two questions to bring it to today, where we are now in Israel and in the broader region. And then I'll turn to the audience questions. Obviously, he was not someone who would not be willing to use the absolute and massive force if and when necessary. But you do mention probably 1982, the invasion of southern Lebanon, that maybe a legacy for him was the thought that there are limitations to military power. You mentioned this is an overreach. We are into Lebanon, but we don't have a good plan for what's happening now. You could say we take out Saddam, and maybe we didn't have a plan for what happens afterwards. Obviously, the entire world expected an enormous response from October 7th. Most hideously, Hamas wanted an enormous response. Not only did they want to kill as many Israelis and Jews as possible, thousands if they could, they were very happy and willing and wanted to have Palestinians killed so they could reclaim the mantle of power. They could, be on the world stage again. They could perhaps disrupt Israeli-Saudi ties. But we talk about the idea of proportionality, something he would have known. And in the book, obviously, it's well beforehand. He did not get along well, or he didn't say much public. He didn't have a great degree of respect for Netanyahu, but he would say something along the lines of, a kingdom is not a king. He would have had difficulty with him. How do you think he would view not the response in the first few weeks, but here we are, sadly, this much further, 1,200 Israelis killed when that was on Netanyahu's watch, 200 taken hostage and held horrifically. In the meantime, approximately 70,000 Palestinians have been killed out of a population of only 2 million. Think about the greater Houston area, that would be if 200,000 Houstonians were killed. What do you think he would think in terms of the response to Hamas's attack? And in some ways, did Netanyahu do exactly what Hamas wanted by continuously keeping this massive level of military operation going on? 80% of the buildings in Gaza damaged or uninhabitable. Who knows what happens to the population? how do you think he would view his response?
Let me begin with this. In 2009, there was a new administration in the White House, and a new administration in Israel. Netanyahu and Obama are elected almost at the same time. And the relationship between the two men is awful. Dislike is an understatement. And the Israelis sense that after years of targeting Iran, that the Americans want some sort of new Middle East, and that the Obama administration wants to legitimize them and give them give them a lead in the Middle East, because the Sunnis have given the Americans forever wars. And Netanyahu he sees his window closing for an attack to take out Iran's nuclear ambitions. And Meir Dagan opposes this with all of his muster. And he didn't oppose it because he opposed Netanyahu politically. He opposed it because Israel was not ready. And if you enter a military campaign that could have disastrous ramifications for the entire Middle East, if not world, you must be able to pull it off successfully and know how it ends. And in retrospect, Dagan was right. Israel in 2009, 2010 didn't have the F-35 stealth fighter bomber. It didn't have refueling capabilities, and it didn't have the networks in Iran in place that it had in 2025 when there was the 12-day war. As per Gaza, the ambition of Hamas, it appears, was to build it and they will come, launch the massive invasion of Israel, and all the other players in the axis of resistance would join in that day. But Yahya Sinwar, the commander of Hamas, didn't trust Hezbollah because he figured that they were compromised by the Mossad. He was right. He didn't trust the Syrians, who were busy selling drugs around the region. And he didn't trust the Iranians, who always wanted to fight the Israelis to the very last Palestinian. So when the war was launched and the Middle East didn't erupt in full-scale violence, the only thing left to do for Hamas was to let the conflict linger in a way where they would somehow keep power, keep the hostages as long as they could, and make Israel appear in the Western media as the greatest Satan since Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, and all the other hated regimes in history. And to that extent, Sinwar was successful. But to take out of the equation the elements of rage, of trauma, and the realization that Israel had to do something that would convince not the people of Gaza, because in history, from the time of Samson to today, has always written off Gaza, but to prove to the people of the West Bank that if they came and joined Hamas in this struggle and provided Israel with its gravest threat to its existence since the founding of the state, that they would meet a similar fate as the Palestinians in Gaza. That being said, Hamas using civilians as human sacrifices is something that increased the death toll unnecessarily. Hamas using aid money, aid food, and all sorts of resources that the good countries of the world provided as black market commodities increased the suffering. The notion that you can build more miles of tunnel than the New York City subway system, but not allow a single civilian to use them as a fallout shelter during bombardment, only proves that the more civilian deaths served your purpose. I can't put words in Meir Dagan's mouth how he would have reacted. He would have been outraged that the arrogance of a first world nation didn't take into consideration a third world threat. But in looking at the Middle East, and give them credit for rebounding somewhat, Netanyahu said all along that the war would take 2 years, and that Israel decided at one point, and all the intelligence services, and just before we discuss October 7th in any stretch, the Mossad doesn't work in Gaza. Military intelligence and the Shin Bet are responsible for Gaza, the West Bank, and a very small sliver of southern Lebanon. The rest of the world, the rest of the Middle East belongs to the Mossad. And the heads of Israeli intelligence, the heads of the military establishment realized that in taking out Hamas and giving it a blow that it could never recover, and taking out the other players, Hezbollah, the Syrians, and the Iranians, that Israel would buy itself enough time to overcome the backlash of being disproportionate in its response, and build a Middle East where the good guys would cooperate and the bad guys would be weakened, compromised, and incapable of launching future operations, invasions that threaten global security. And out of October 7th, there are a few realities that happened that Israeli intelligence had not predicted, but that are now true. One is that it proved to Israelis who were Jewish, Israelis who were Bedouin, Muslim, or Christian, that they're all Jews, that serving the blue and white flag will make you hated anywhere and everywhere around the world. The other thing it proved was that Israel was in the Middle East. Israel became fat, lazy, and spoiled. It was a startup nation. Its economy was booming. It was a global leader in the high-tech industry. Life in Israel was akin to life in Italy. But across that fence was the third world. Across that fence was Mogadishu squared. So this reality came roosting home. And finally, and this is perhaps most daunting because this is where we're in now and nobody knows where it's going, Middle Eastern wars are no longer fought on the battlefield. Middle Eastern wars are now fought on social media and on the new flashpoints, London and New York. We're on the streets of these cities, the new battlefield of public opinion, of an alliance. You mentioned that terrorism in the 70s was left-wing and socialist. There's an alliance right now around the world of the fundamentalists of Islamism and socialism. And this is a very dangerous phenomenon because young people who receive their news in snippets and in very small portions, manipulated by AI, manipulated by state players, namely the Qataris, are now the people who are poised to be the decision makers of tomorrow. And they're not individuals who've learned the lessons of the world on the battlefield or watching or traveling the world and seeing how people operate and meeting people from the other side. Their world is forged by the telephone, by remote access. This is a danger. This is a danger to the West. And going back to what I said, that Meir Dagan always viewed Israel's struggle as part of a greater Western struggle. Well, we're in it now, and I don't really know how this will end, and if the good guys are going to end up on top. Because if the narrative can be that rapes and mutilations that were captured on GoPro cameras and filmed on phones and broadcast on social media didn't happen, then you can convince people of anything. And the one thread that connects all of these facets, all of these dangers, is anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is the superhighway of this anti-Western phenomenon that we're living in. I think it was Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel laureate, Holocaust survivor, who said, who always said that what begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And I think that Meir Dagan would have been horrified by the world in which we find ourselves now. And people that I interviewed for the book was commissioned a month before October 7th. And I was supposed to leave for Israel on Sunday, October 8th. And the importance of the book, to me at least, was to tell the story of Israel's struggle to survival through the eyes of this man, through the big picture through small eyes, yet put it somewhat in context for October 7th and what happened after. Because the Middle East has changed in many ways for the better. But when the Middle East sort of settles down, and nobody knows what's going to happen in Iran today, tomorrow, or in 3 weeks, but the Middle Eastern wars are now fought on the streets of America, the streets of the Western democracies, and I'm not sure that countries that have allowed the takeover and the entryism to become almost irremovable can survive in a way that helps the United States and the other like-minded nations persevere through this really uncertain storm.
Hey, maybe just two or three just audience questions just quickly. And I don't want to keep you guys, and I'm volunteering you to sign books right behind us in just a minute. You already touched upon and discussed a lot of it, but maybe you could, anything you haven't mentioned or you want to add. Lauren asks, what do you attribute Israel's surprise on October 7th to? And related to that, Batya asks, since Israel intelligence is regarded as the best, how did they miss October 7th? And maybe just related to that, you mentioned the funding for Hamas. U.S., Saudis made big we put a lot of money into Mujahideen in the 1980s in Afghanistan, kind of came back to bite us. Did Netanyahu's take a horrible gamble and lose by allowing massive amounts of Qatari money to support Hamas, in some ways just to offset and keep a united Palestinian front and to balance Fatah? Those two questions.
Yes to everything you said. Intelligence agencies are only as good as their last screw up. Special operations units are only as good as their last foul up. There is no permanence in reputation. So October 7th happened for many reasons. Arrogance is one. Israel didn't believe that Hamas posed an existential threat. And most of its assets were pointed north toward Hezbollah. And I think we saw that with the Beeper operation and the subsequent assassinations, that Israel really had a good idea of what was happening with Hezbollah. And they destroyed an organization that was 10 times stronger than Hamas. And I need to say it because it's important. Yes, Hamas dug tunnels underneath Israel. Yes, Hamas surprised Israel and was hiding in plain sight. They didn't invent that tactic. Hezbollah tried in 2018 to launch an attack against Galilee from tunnels they had dug underneath the Israeli border with Lebanon, and to send thousands of Radwan Force commandos into northern Israel, kill as many people as they could, and take as many people back. The Israelis discovered the tunnel, and they filled them with cement, and they blew a few of them up secretly. There's a great video, if you go to YouTube, of a Hezbollah digger coming to work on the tunnel, and he sees an Israeli little robot give off a smoke grenade. And the guy screams in Arabic, and he curses, and he runs away in fear. So the idea was to combine the terror forces in the Middle East against Israel. And that failed. The destruction of the Jewish state as we know it failed. So the intelligence was focused elsewhere, and it underestimated the resolve of Hamas to attack Israel, invade Israel. And I spoken to soldiers on the ground and to policemen. The Israeli police were the last line of defense. They didn't get the credit that they deserve, but they really saved the day on October 7th. And had Hamas not focused on the rapes and mutilations and kidnappings and the looting, they could have been another 20 miles into Israel that day. So, yes, Israel was caught by surprise. Israel was caught by an arrogance. The female soldiers that were on the observation towers were reporting movements long before October 7th. They were ignored. There was a document called Jericho Walls that Israel had uncovered that was a playbook of Hamas. But, and I think this is really important in understanding, I know that this is the Foreign Policy Council. Let's just say that Israel, that Netanyahu had learned precisely of the Hamas attack at 3 a.m. on October 7th, and he had ordered a full mobilization, and the Air Force was pushing on him to go and launch a preemptive strike. Netanyahu's first call would have been to President Biden, and Biden's question would be, "How do you know for certain?" And Netanyahu said, "We have the intelligence," and the fear would have been that Biden would have said that if you attack first, we will not be able to have your back. Because that's precisely what Prime Minister Golda Meir underwent 50 years, almost to the day of October 7th in 1973, when she figured that if Israel is caught by surprise and attacked, that they will have the sympathy of the world, and they need the sympathy of the world and the shipments of arms and the political support to keep Israel afloat for enough time to allow it to counterattack. Because the political support of being attacked is important. Because today, even though Israel was attacked and caught by surprise, there are efforts in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice to demonize and delegitimize Israel's defensive operations as war crimes and as genocide, as a way to kick Israel out of the United Nations, to kick Israel out of international organizations. So just imagine had Israel struck first. The fear here is that the intelligence services are always going to be held to a standard that doesn't jive with the political realities. Yes, Israel was weakened by internal discourse. The judicial overhaul reform caused protests in the streets. Yes, Hamas saw that Israel was vulnerable and this was the time to act, and they said that if they attack, all the others will attack. Perhaps Israel's greatest failure, intelligence failure, was that in around 2017, after years of back and forth and conflicts in Gaza against Hamas. Mind you, in 2014, Israel and Hamas fought a war that was a precursor to this. And it was a war where the Obama administration was incredibly critical of Israel's actions. And the Obama administration introduced the Qataris and the Turks as negotiators with Hamas, introducing them to the fold. Whereas traditionally, everything that went from Israel to Hamas went via Cairo. And the Israelis were horrified by this. But this was a genie that was out of the bottle because the Qataris had money and Turkey was a member of NATO. In 2017, the Israelis make a decision. Netanyahu makes a decision. The intelligence services are okay with this. That if money flows in from Qatar into Gaza, and the Palestinians who live there have a better life and live the American dream where they can hope for their children a better life than they live themselves, then maybe they'll be too busy driving Mercedes and traveling and enjoying the good life and won't be as interested in destroying the Jewish state. And that was a horrific and unimaginably deadly mistake that Israel made. And ultimately, the buck stops with Netanyahu, and you know, his administration of the time really needs to take the fall for this. I don't know if they're going to take it politically. But if you look at the rest of the Middle East, what happened since October 7th, Netanyahu, for some uncanny way, has come out on top. The relationship with the United States is stronger than ever. For the first time in history, the United States and Israel operated jointly against Iran. It could be very well be that as we're here now in Houston, things are happening in Iran to begin the next phase of this. So there is a new Middle East. So I think history will have to be the judge of everything, but the uncertainty and the political upheaval that Gaza became is as dangerous to Israel's survival and the stability of the West as anything that has happened since the end of the Cold War.
We'll wrap it all up, and I want to finish with a great student question, a great way to finish it. But again, as Marian mentioned, we'd love to see, especially any of you who are new. We're always adding events. We have 4 events here in 5 days, which is kind of crazy. As you mentioned, on Saturday, we're hosting Pulitzer Prize winner John Meacham. A lot of you might know him. I personally think he's probably the best American historian alive today. We still have some room left there. We're almost full. Other things to keep an eye out for, International Women's Day. We have a great program for that at March 17th. March 26th, a face some of you might know, former CNN Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty, who has a lot of great experience with Russia and Putin. And then we don't have the exact dates yet, but I'm working on it. And we are a bipartisan organization. We host Democrats, host Republicans. We're looking to host Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who's also probably best known as his key or most influential speechwriter. And then we're also hoping in June to bring back Vice President Mike Pence. But just to finish it here, and again, I'm volunteering you to sign books afterwards. I'm sorry. A great question from Michael from the Audio National School. And you students really make me feel confident and positive about the world. You guys are so smart. And just if you want to add, just a way to conclude, anything else you want to touch on. He says, Meir Dagan shifted Mossad from a reactive intelligence gathering to proactive disruption. Do you think that shift permanently changed how Israel defines deterrence, and maybe any kind of last word on Mossad and where it is today?
Whoever came up with that question, you're spot on. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And what the Mossad was able to do in Iran was beyond mind-boggling in terms of setting up networks, building factories for drones that would be used, identifying not only the methods and means by which the leadership operated, but by realizing that since these people didn't, for example, ever take their phones with them, but their bodyguards had phones, you knew exactly where they were all the time. Just remember that Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, was assassinated at a protected guest house in Tehran by the Mossad. The ability of this organization that became proactive under Meir Dagan is mind-boggling. The human intelligence, the activation of cells of indigenous people who are opposed to the regime, identifying these people and working with them is an unbelievable achievement for any intelligence chief. But intelligence work is not something that happens from day to day or hour to hour. In 2002, when Dagan became head of the Mossad, he had 2 missions: fight terrorism and stop Iran. It would take 23 years, and he didn't live to see it, for the fruits of his labor, for the networks the seeds that he planted to emerge and blossom. And I think that the reputation of the organization as proactive, as absolutely creative and astoundingly courageous and innovative that he instilled is living large today and is a central piece in not only Israel's national security, but also that of the nations of the West, including the United States, that rely on this intelligence.
Excellent. And you'll learn even more and be engaged and amazed by the book as well. Like I said, we'll have a line up there for any of you who want to buy it, and another line to meet Sam and get to sign it. And will you all please join me in thanking Samuel Katz. Thank you.
Thank you very much.